Well, 2 weeks ago, we focused on what I believe I called our problem in our society today. And I mentioned that if I was to ask a group of people, what's wrong with our society today? What's wrong with our culture today? We would get a whole list of issues. And I said when we talked 2 weeks ago that the trouble with coming up with the issues that we would all come up with is that they are not the problem with our culture today. They're the symptoms of what the problem is in our culture today. And so often as Christians we focus on the symptoms and not the problem. And just like in a physical situation, the symptoms point to what the real problem is, but unless we deal with the problem, the symptoms will never really go away. Well, we may relieve the symptoms to some degree, but if we don't deal with the problem, the symptoms will continue because they're not the cause. They're just the evidence of the cause. They point back to the real problem that exists. We said 2 weeks ago that what I would consider the real problem in our society today is the fact that God has been removed from people's thinkings. And that in many ways, God is even removed from our argument as Christians. How many times do we argue some of the social ills or the social evils or whatever you want to call them of our society today without ever going back to God? And without ever really discussing God and who God is. And when we do that in our society, we're focusing on the symptoms and not the problem. And if we're going to be successful, as I've said several times, in being salt and light in our society today, we've got to focus on the problem. We've got to be able to bring God back into our discussion. We need to bring God back into our argument. And we need to be able to talk with people about who God is and what God wants and about what God expects in our lives today. Think about this for a minute. And I hadn't really given this a lot of thought until a few weeks ago. But think about this for a minute. All of our actions today are determined by our belief in God. All of our actions today are determined by our belief in God. If we do not believe God exists, that controls our actions. Controls what we say and what we do and how we act. If we believe that God exists, then our actions are controlled by that. If we misunderstand who God is, then we act according to what we believe about God. Our actions today and our attitudes today are really determined by what we believe about God. And I kind of want to continue that line of thinking just for one more week today and think about how to bring God back into our discussions. How to bring God back into our discussions on the social things and the hot topics, if you want to call them that are a part of our society and our discussions today. I mentioned 2 weeks ago that I was basing a lot of my thoughts on a book entitled God is the Issue, written by a man named Brad Bright. And I want to give credit where credit is due this morning. A lot of the things that I'm sharing I got from his book. And I don't want to take time all through the message to say I got this from him and this from him. But a number of the things that I'm going to share came from his book. And if you want a copy of the book, I have a copy. And I'm done with it at this point, so I'll give it to you. You can look through it. But I want to give credit where credit's due, and I am taking some of my thoughts from Brad Bright's book entitled God is the Issue. As I said already, you and I as Christians are to be salt and light in our world today. You and I are to represent God in our world. You and I are to represent God to those that don't know Him. Now think about the awesomeness of that responsibility. Think about the fact that you and I are to represent God everywhere we go. If people know that we claim to be a Christian, we are representing God to them. And in many ways, their idea of who God is comes from watching us and listening to us and seeing who we are and how we act and all of those things. That's an awesome responsibility. It's an overwhelming responsibility if we really stop and think about it. Because, some people's image of God are directly related to us, to you, and to me. One of the ways that we represent God today, or one of the ways that we need to represent God today, is by having compassion on people. If you look at the life of Jesus, there were very few people that he didn't demonstrate compassion to. And I say very few because I think there were some that he didn't. And I think those were the religious leaders of the day. Those that were intentionally or not, leading people away from God. And they were hard-hearted, and they were hypocrites, and they were blasphemous in many ways. Maybe you could argue to them Jesus didn't show a whole lot of compassion. But to everybody else, Jesus showed tremendous compassion. When people looked at Jesus, they may or may not have agreed with what he was saying, but there was no question that he loved them. There was no question that he cared about them. And I thought, one of the ways that we need to represent God in our society today is by having compassion. By demonstrating compassion to people. Not a compassion or not a love that says whatever you want to do is fine. Not a love that says go and do whatever you want and it's all okay. But a love and a compassion that desires to see the deep-rooted need in people and the desire to see that need met. The desire to see them come to Christ and the desire to see God begin to change their thinking and God begin to change their lives. Far too often today, and take this for what it's worth, far too often today, Christians, or those that call themselves Christians, reject people because they are sinners, which is exactly why we need to reach out to them. Too often today, Christians, or those that name the name of Christ, reject people because of their sinfulness, which is exactly why Jesus came. Jesus came to save sinners. He didn't come to save those that weren't sinners. He didn't come to save those that were righteous. He came to save those that were sinners. And so often we reject people today because they're sinners. And we tell them that unless they can clean up their lives and change, that the church and that Jesus and that God want no part of them. And that is so far from the truth. I was thinking as I was putting some thoughts together this week of Matthew chapter 9. And it says here that Jesus reclined at the table in a house. And behold, there were many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples at the table. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to Jesus' disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I have come not to call the righteous, but I have come to call sinners." Jesus went into the house and he sits down with sinners. He sits down with tax collectors. That might have been lower term than sinners in Jesus' day. They were outcast. They were, generally speaking, not religious people. They were despised and hated by the world, and even more so by the religious leaders. And Jesus walked into the home, sat back at the table, reclined at the table, and ate with them. And the religious leaders said, "What is this man doing? What is he thinking? Doesn't he know that we godly people don't go to their homes, and we don't talk to them, that we stay away from them because they're such sinners? Doesn't Jesus know that?" And I thought, when somebody says something like that, they forget the fact that we're all sinners. And that none of us are deserving of God's love. And yet, in many ways, we benefit because God is a loving, gracious, merciful Heavenly Father. I don't want you to name anybody this morning, but How many of you have ever said or heard said, we'll blame somebody else, how many has ever heard somebody say, well-meaning Christian, you don't have anything to do with those people? And we can name groups. And how many times have we Christians said, you know what, don't have anything to do with them. That's wrong. Stay away from them. Now, this group over here, I'm not pointing at Tom. Don't have anything to do with Tom. No, don't have anything to do with this group. And oh my word, do you know what these people over here believe? Do you know what awful sinners they are? Stay away from them. I have people at times, Christians will call and say, how do I deal? I'm specifically, intentionally not naming groups. But I've had people call and say, hey, I have this person in my class, and I know that as a Christian I'm supposed to stay away from them. How do I deal with it? I hear that all the time. And my statement, first of all, is who told you to stay away from them? Well, other Christians said that. Really? Did they read the New Testament? Did they know that Jesus came to save sinners? Do they know that Jesus sat at the house with tax collectors and sinners and ate lunch? And do they know that those that would have called themselves, they wouldn't have used this term, I realize, but those that we would have called Christians in that day, said, stay away from them. What are you doing? Don't you know how bad they are? Brad Bright in his book said this, and I think it's a powerful statement. He said, we, speaking of Christians, are often hated, not because people see Jesus, but because they see us as self-righteous Pharisees, all too eager to cast the first stone. And I think that's true. I think sometimes those that we call sinners look at us as Christians and all they see is people that are ready to start throwing stones. And yet it's interesting to me that when we look at the Gospels, we see Jesus having tremendous compassion on some of those groups of people. Now, don't misunderstand me. We never see Jesus telling them that their lifestyle is okay. We never see Jesus saying, go on and keep doing what you're doing and I'll love you anyway. Never see that. But we do see Jesus looking past the external groups that these people would fit into in seeing something much deeper. A spiritual need. And Jesus doesn't ignore the outward sinfulness, but he gets to the deeper heart of the issue and the fact that they need God in their lives. And one of the greatest places I believe that we see that is in John chapter 4. And we could look at, the Gospels are full of examples. It's full of examples. And I just settled on this one in John chapter 4. In John chapter 4, Jesus had been teaching and ministering with his disciples in Judea. And the time came for him to leave Judea and go down to Galilee. That sounds really simple. He's going to leave Judea, he's going to go to Galilee. And yet when he left Judea, he said to his disciples, or it says here, that he needed to go through Samaria. He needed to go through Samaria. Now, that would have been the shortest way for Jesus to get from Judea to Galilee. But it wasn't the preferred way. It wasn't the preferred way. Most, if not all, Jews would never go through Samaria. Ever. They hated the Samaritans. They hated the Samaritans. And so the Jews, even though that's quicker, the Jews would have gone the long way around to avoid being anywhere near this group of the Samaritans. It would almost be like, and I don't know if this is a good example or a bad example, but it's the one I thought of, so I'll use it. It would almost be like saying, okay, I need to leave church today and go to Tawanda. But I don't like the people in Rome. So I'm going to go to Sayre and go that way to Tawanda. Because I wouldn't think of driving through Rome. That's kind of exactly this. So The Jews would never go there. And so Jesus said, I have to go through Samaria. And my point in all of that is this. Jesus did not avoid those around him that were considered outcast by his fellow Jews. The Jewish people that associated with Jesus would have said, no, don't do that. You know that we can't go there. You know that those people we don't agree with. And those people will make you unclean. You better not go there. Jesus went there anyway. If there was any group that the Jews did not associate with, the Samaritans were it. And yet Jesus said, I have to go through Samaria. In verses 5 through 8, Jesus did not only pass through Samaria, while he was in Samaria, he did the unthinkable. He did the unthinkable. And the unthinkable here was this. He spoke to a Samaritan. He talked to her. And that was forbidden by the Jews for at least 3 reasons. Number 1, she was a she. She was a woman. Number 2, she was a Samaritan woman. A Jewish man would never speak to a Samaritan, and certainly not to a Samaritan woman. And number 3, she was a stranger. It wasn't somebody that Jesus knew. It wasn't like he knew her and called her by name and they had been friends at some point. She was a complete stranger. And so for those 3 reasons, a Jewish man would have never spoken to this woman. To a Jewish person, a Samaritan woman would have been considered unclean 100% of the time. A Samaritan woman would have been considered completely unclean. Somebody that was never associated with. And then Jesus asked her for a drink of water. And again, I'm not exaggerating when I say most Jews, if not all of them, would have gone thirsty before they would have ever asked a Samaritan person for a drink. They would have not done that. They would have dehydrated. They would have gone thirsty. They would have continued their trip and hoped to find water somewhere else. They would have never asked a Samaritan person or a woman for a drink of water. And then Jesus was literally asking to drink water from one of her dishes. One of her vases, one of her glasses, one of her bowls. Now, again, that would have never happened. Because the Jews would say it would be better to be thirsty than to ask or to drink something that a Samaritan woman was going to give you. And so Jesus was going outside of the box here. He was going outside of what any of the Jewish people would have ever considered. And yet it's interesting to me as we read that passage, Jesus was able to look past those things and see something in this woman that nobody else saw. And what Jesus saw was that this woman had a deep spiritual need that could only be met in a personal relationship with God. And you and I today need to be careful when we begin to look at some of these groups of people that we are often told as Christians that we need to stay away from. We need to be careful that when we look at them, what we see is not the outward appearance, the external things that Jesus would have seen here. We need to begin to see the deep spiritual need that they have in their hearts and lives. And rather than trying to change their mind or their opinion or their lifestyle or anything else, we need to be concerned about ministering to that deep spiritual need. It's not you and I winning arguments that changes people's lives. It's a personal relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ that changes people's lives. And we need to make sure that we do not forget that. As Jesus is talking with this woman, and as he's discussing her spiritual need, he's discussing the fact that he is living water. He's discussing the fact, ultimately, that what she needs is faith in him. There are two issues that come up. And we really could plug in any social issue here that you wanted. You could. You can take any social issue that we argue today and plug them in here instead of what I'm going to say. And the same will be true with every one of them. But two issues come up. First of all, the issue that comes up is this woman's marital status. Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and bring him here." And the woman answered and said, I don't have a husband. And Jesus said, "You're right in saying you don't have a husband, for you have had 5. And the one that you have now is not your husband, so what you said is true." Now, this has the potential here to be a side trail, a rabbit trail. Because when her marital status comes up, the truth is she's been married and divorced 5 times. And the fellow that she's living with now is not her husband. So she's been married and divorced 5 times, and now she's co-inhabiting with somebody that she's not married to. And it would be very easy here for Jesus to condemn her marriage and her divorce, and to dive into a discussion about the moral situation that she is in. It'd be very easy to do that. It would be very easy to lecture her on how divorce is not of God. And then it would be very easy to point to her and say, well, you know, lying's not that good either. And it would be very easy to dive into a moral discussion on the way that she's lived her life. But you know what? She knows that what she's done is not right. That's why she lied about it. She knows that what she's done, she knows the way that she's lived is not a godly way of life. And so rather than dive into the teaching on those things, Jesus points to something else. He points to something else. We're going to talk about what that is in a minute. He didn't say that what she was doing was okay. He didn't say, yeah, keep doing what you're doing and I'm going to love you anyway. And we know that because she said in verse 19, I perceive that you're a prophet. You know my life. You know the way I live. She got that. But then she goes on and she says, okay. She brings up another issue. Where do they worship? Where do we worship? She says, I perceive that you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you, Jews, you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Now, she's bringing up another social issue of the day. Again, plug in any social issue you want, and the same truth will be the same. The social issue of that day is where do we worship? This woman, a Samaritan, would have believed that the right place to worship God was on Mount Gerizim. The Jewish people believed that the Temple Mount in Jerusalem was the place to worship. Now, you and I look at that today and we say, that's not a big deal. It was to them. It was to them. It was the social issue that separated the Samaritans and the Jews. They fought tooth and nail over this issue. Is it right? Is it wrong? No, we need to worship on Mount Gerizim. No, Jerusalem's where we got to worship. And if you're not worshiping here, you're not a real Christian. You're not a real child of God. It was a huge, huge issue. Now, again, Jesus could have easily dove into that issue. He could have easily lectured her and defended the idea of worshiping God in Jerusalem. But that's not what Jesus did. It's not what he did at all. What he did is, he pointed her to the fact that it really doesn't matter where you worship, but God needs to be worshipped in spirit and in truth. And he ends up, to make a long story short, telling her ultimately that what she needs is faith in God. And what she needs is to receive him, the living water, and the Messiah that she was looking for. Jesus is saying, ultimately, those other things don't matter. What you really need is faith in God. What you really need is to receive the Messiah that has come. Now notice the result of that. Skip down with me, way down to verse 39. Of course, in the preceding verses, this woman had left Jesus, went out and told the whole world in Samaria. You're never going to guess what happened to me today. A Jewish man talked to me. And you know what he said? Let me tell you what he said. He told me about Jesus and the Messiah, and I needed salvation. And notice verse 39. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him, Jesus, because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. Notice the result. Many of the Samaritans believed. They came to faith. They trusted in who Jesus was, and it changed their lives. What would have been the result if Jesus had argued the social issues rather than point them to what the real need was? What would have happened? What would have been missing? What would have been lacking? You would not have read verse 39. You would have read that she went away probably angry. And the opportunity to share about her need of faith never happened. You and I as Christians today need to demonstrate the compassion of Jesus Christ on those around us. One of the ways that we do that is by looking past the symptoms that we see in people today and looking at the genuine needs of the heart. Now, I have an illustration I want to share, and some of you, Georgie I know did, because she mentioned it. An illustration of a discussion that I had on Facebook about a week ago. It's interesting when you're thinking through some of these things, how many times God gives you the opportunity to put it to practice. And he did. And so I'll share this illustration, and I think the point of it will be obvious. But I posted a picture, I don't know, a week and a half ago now, of Justin and I having a successful turkey hunt. And many of you saw that on Facebook. A picture of Justin and I holding a turkey that he had shot. And one of the ladies that I graduated from high school with, and I haven't seen her in a long time, posted about, and again, this isn't going to be word for word, posted how sad that was that we had killed a turkey and wished that they had guns to shoot back. And so I read that, and my initial reaction, like yours would have been, was to post a discussion on there about hunting and the morality of hunting, and to argue that issue. That was my initial reaction. But I've been working on this message. And I thought, no, it wouldn't be the right thing to do, would it? And in her discussion, at one point, she mentioned a couple of times about, speaking of herself, my God. My God wouldn't approve. And my God doesn't like some of these things. And so my response, and again, this isn't word for word, but my response to some degree was, we could argue the right and wrong of hunting all day long. But it wouldn't make any difference, because I'm not going to change my mind, and I'm certainly not going to change yours. But I said, something I am interested in that you said is, I'm interested in your God. You mentioned a couple of things about your God, and I think that I know quite a bit about religion and gods. But I'm not familiar with the teaching that you said, so who do you worship? Who is your God? And so she got back and responded back to me about her God, and in essence said that her God was a reference to God, and it was more a way to defend what she seemed right. It was in a sense of, well, this is what I believe, but I'm going to say my God says, because that's just kind of a way to present what I said. So I said, okay, so in essence you're telling me that you are your own God. Well, no, I'm not saying that at all. It was just God is a way to defend my way of thinking. And I said, okay, that's fine. But then I got back and she said, well, because I said to her, I'd love to discuss these things. And at some point she said something along the lines of, I'm not really a fan of organized religion. And so I'm not sure that I really want to discuss that with you. And so my response was, okay, I'm not a fan of organized religion either. As a matter of fact, I hate organized religion. Because organized religion is a form of man jumping through hoops to try to please a God. And organized religion, in all honesty, is often used by leaders of organized religion to motivate people to do things that they probably shouldn't be doing. So I don't like organized religion either, and I'm glad that we don't want to discuss that. But what I do believe is that the Bible teaches that we need to have a relationship with God through faith Jesus Christ. And it's different than organized religion. And so then she sent me another message, and we started sending private messages because I didn't want to just continue this whole thing on public media. And so she sent me a message, and she thanked me a couple of times for not deleting her as a friend, and said that, you know, our conversation is really challenging my thinking. Now, my initial response is, why do you think that she thought I would delete her as a friend?
Because you wanted to buy content.
Because she's one of those groups that we avoid as Christians, right? Yeah, exactly. Where do you think she got that from?
Other Christians.
Other Christians, exactly. She said, I really appreciate you not deleting me, and I appreciate our conversation. And so when she said that, I thanked her for the discussion, and I assumed that was the end of our discussion. When I got up the next morning, I had a new message on my Facebook account that simply said this, and this is word for word. Would you pray for me? I'm scared. And so I said, okay. And I sent her a message back. And I said, I would most certainly love to pray for you. And I'm sorry that something is scaring you. And she sent me another message back, and she said, well, my husband and I are traveling to, and I guess I won't say the name of the country, one of the few communist dictatorships that we still have in the world today. She said, my husband and I are traveling in a couple of weeks. And I understand that they're part of some type of ambassador program. I didn't quite understand all of that. But they're going to this communistic dictatorship on an ambassador-type trip, and she's scared to death of what's going to happen while they're there. And I said to her, you know, I'll be glad to pray for you. And then it dawned on me, I couldn't remember when her trip was. So I sent her another message, and I said, I waited a couple of days, and I sent her another message, and I said, hey, just so that I can pray for you, when is your trip? And she said, oh, we're leaving on this date and coming back on this date. And I said, that's wonderful. I will keep you in prayer. And I thought, you know, I'd love to get to the point right now and say, you know, she sent me a message and said, hey, tell me about your God. I want to know Christ. She hasn't done that yet. And I don't know if she will or not. But where would this discussion have gone if I'd have dove into the social issue that started it, rather than look beyond that and say, it really doesn't matter what she believes about this. What's more important is God. And we're going to discuss God. And now I have to believe that the Lord in some way is using that discussion, and will during this whole travel, to give me another opportunity to say, let me tell you more about my God. When many would have missed the whole opportunity because they would have focused on the social issue that has no eternal ramifications whatsoever. You and I, our challenge this week is to look beyond the social issues that we see this week and begin to see people's needs for what they really are. And to begin to look at the problem, which is the fact that they need Jesus Christ in their lives. And nothing else matters. Because ultimately it's only Him that can change them. Only Him that can make them new. And apart from Jesus Christ, nothing else really matters. Let's take a moment and pray. Father, I thank you this morning for your word. Thank you for an example of Jesus Christ with a woman that all of the religious people of that day would have avoided completely. And yet Jesus had the opportunity to talk with her about her deep-seated spiritual needs. And from that discussion, a whole bunch of people got saved. Lord, I pray that you would help us today not to ignore the social evils or issues of the day, not to pretend they don't exist, but every one of them is an opportunity to point people to what the real need in their lives is. And Lord, help us not to miss those opportunities. Help us to share Christ and to bring the discussion back to where it needs to be. And Lord, again, help us to be the salt and light that you're calling us to be. We thank you in Jesus' name.